Hello and thank you for watching this video. This will be a very short and brief introduction to SAS Enterprise Miner, which is a tool used to bring data in, analyze it with respect to data mining, and then producing an output which assists you in feeding a model data and having that model give you additional information based upon how that model was created. So in order to use this tool, it is available as a client that runs in your browser and will be launched by your browser connecting to our SAS server. This means that number one, you need to have an account on our SAS Unix server. Okay, let's get started, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to type the following URL into the web browser. I do apologize for the length of this. There's really no way to shorten it. So as we're talking, you do want to make a note of this, and I will provide this link at the end of this video as well. But basically this gets you to the login screen where you have various tabs, and in applications you'll be hitting the launch window for Enterprise Miner 6.2. Again, you should have a Unix account, otherwise this will not work. We're going to go ahead and press launch. This is a Java program, so you should also have Java Runtime Environment 6 or any version thereof. Once we get to the SAS Enterprise Miner screen, we'll be typing in your username and your password. Again, your administrator, SAS administrator, will give you that. And you should also, for convenience, check this box so that you don't have to type it in again. The server is automatically filled in because when you clicked on the web page, this is what is fed to the login screen. We're going to press log on. And after some time, we'll see the Enterprise Miner development environment. Okay, what I'm going to first do is get you familiar with the interface so that you can see some basic examples of how to navigate around, and then we'll be producing a very simple modeling project so that you can get your feet wet and get very familiar with the interface in a short amount of time. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and open up a new project first so that you get familiar with how to start off. But then we're going to work with a recent project I built for this demonstration so that you get a good feel of how to actually construct a working model. First, let's start off with new project. And I'm going to click on that link. And when you do this, it's going to ask you a few questions about where you want to place things. Most of the time you can just pick the defaults. So here we'll pick the default logical workspace server. We'll give it our own name. I'll just call it my project 1. And the SAS server directory typically points to, when you hit the browse button, points to your home Unix directory. So since I don't happen to know that offhand, I'm going to let it point it to that home directory, and I'm just going to click OK. It does take a little while for this application to go to the Unix server and get the directory and show it to you, so there is a little delay. But once you do that, you can navigate, and now I can remember where my directory is. If I go to, okay, I'm going to scroll down until I hit the home directory, and then I'm going to double click. I just double clicked. There is a delay, and if you're patient, it will respond. It's going to the server and then coming back. That's why there's a delay. And I see my name, Mark Lyons. I'm going to go ahead and pick my folder by double clicking. I just did that. And again, there's a delay, so be patient. And then I'm going to go into my SAS directory within my home directory. Now, all of these folders your SAS administrator will give you so that you can just navigate to where you want to go. In this case, I have some other projects that I've built before, so I'm just going to click OK. And the project that I just assigned, my project 1, will actually build a folder right in here. It'll say my project 1, and in that folder will contain all of the things, including your diagrams, your model, any data sources. It'll all be in that folder, just like these projects up here. I'm going to click OK now. Okay, good. So now we have a path, and we're going to click Next. Good. After a short delay, we see the user interface come up, and now we're going to just briefly talk about some of the buttons that you're going to hit and some of the windows and how to use them in the most common way. We'll go into detail with other videos later. We're going to just give you the easiest, most generic methods in this very short video. Okay, once you have reached this stage where you're ready to begin a project, the first thing you're going to do is create a diagram space. And so what we're going to do is go over to the left where we actually open up the folder, and we're going to right-click on Diagram, and we're going to say Create Diagram. The reason why we're creating a diagram is that's where you put your building blocks to create your flow. In other words, data comes in, data gets processed, and something useful comes out. That's your flow, your workflow. So let's go ahead and type in a diagram name, and I'll call this My Project 1 Diagram. You can call it anything you want, really, and it doesn't even have to have your project name in it. It could be anything. Clicking OK. Now we have a project diagram space, and this is good because now we can start to bring in buttons and bring in what we call nodes. And nodes are connected together like building blocks. You actually provide the connections, and each node does something very specific. So let's get familiar with the workspace. So typically when we bring in data, we would use nodes to bring in data, but I'm going to show you an easier way to do it as a beginner. Typically we would use a file import node, and by the way, you can put your cursor over any of these nodes and you'll find out very quickly what they do, and there's tabs here. You can scroll over each one of them, but for ease of use as a beginner, I'm going to discourage you from using this file import node, and I'm going to show you a better way to do this. Instead, we're going to go to My Project, and in here there is something known as Project Start Code. By the way, whenever you click on any object in your diagram on here, the property windows will give you options to change the behavior of whatever it is you've clicked on. In this case, my project has behaviors and properties. I'm going to go into the properties window here when I've clicked on this, and I'm going to change the behavior of this project. The project start code is going to have a single line you're going to type in. The easiest way as a beginner to bring in your data is to create a lib name. Let's do that right now. So I'm going to hit the project start code button, and we're going to enter in a new data source. I'm clicking it now. Okay, so I went ahead and pasted in 3 versions of how to bring data into your project. They all start off with the word libname. And what this allows you to do is if you create a library name that points to a path, then you can then bring in a data source simply by dragging and dropping it into your diagram. And this is the first step. The first line is reading it in from my C drive. The second line happens to be reading it in from my Unix directory. The third line is reading it in with Oracle. And notice in Oracle you have to type in a couple of extra things. With Oracle, I'm giving it, like the others, my lib name, in this case my Oracle data. That will represent this entire line. So we're telling SAS in this special case to use an Oracle engine. That means that it has code that can read and write to Oracle tables. In addition, I'm giving it my username, I'm giving it my password, and I'm also giving it a path, which in this case is can be translated typically for the more common name of database. Path, database means the same thing, path or database, and I'm also giving it a schema by which to connect. So here we have 3 examples. I'm only going to use one of them. It doesn't matter what example you use, whether it's your C drive or Unix or Oracle or whatever you want to connect to. We'll go into more detail about this in a very special video for data sources. But we're just going to use one of these. So let's go on to the next step. Now what I've done is I've put a comment in front of it because the line that I'm really going to execute is just above here with my real username and password. It's not going to be shown on the video, obviously. But what I do want to get across is that we have the ability to run this code and have SAS respond back to us that it was or was not successful. It's very important that you do that so that you know your data connections are valid. So we're in the code window, we're going to run it, we'll switch to the log window and check it. Let's go ahead and click the Run Now button, and we see an error. So what we're going to do is go to the log and find out where the error is occurring. Now we've just hit the log button and we see an error in the log saying that my Oracle data is not a valid SAS name. So here's what I want to get across is when you create libnames, there's a 9-character limitation. It's very important you understand that. If we shorten this name, it's going to work fine. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this code by clicking the Run Now button. And when it's done, it should come back. It just turned black again. Good. Now I'm going to go to the log window, and we will see that the My Oracle libref was successfully assigned. Good. Now we can use this as a path and bring in data sources located within that path. Now when I click on data sources, I am right-clicking. I can now create a data source. We are not seeing My Oracle libname yet. We will. I'm right-clicking on data sources and clicking on Create Data Source. Now don't worry, I know this is a little contradictory. It says SAS table. The fact is, when you bring in Oracle tables into SAS, it's just as good as being a SAS table. So overlook that one discrepancy, please. We're going to just say yes to a SAS table and click Next. Next we're going to choose a table, but we get to choose the libref My Oracle that we created, My Oracle, and when we do that we're going to see tables in that path. So let's go to Browse and let's pick the My Oracle data path that we just created. And now we see a list of paths or library references, in other words libnames, that point to different paths, and as we scroll over them we can see what path they point to. My Oracle happens to be pointing to the Oracle SBUD database. If you go to Maps or other paths, you'll see that these paths are different. Let's choose this one. I'm going to click on that, and then we will see what data is available in that path. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to grab this data source and I am going to click OK. So now we have My Oracle. We're picking the data source and click Next. Very good. And this gives you some information about it. We're going to continue. Now, this is a very important turning point that you need to make a note of. If we choose Advanced, we can do something that's going to make our life a whole lot easier. That's what this whole introductory video is about, is making your transition as a beginner easier. And then we're going to hit Next. Now, here is something that's going to make our life very, very easy. When we do data mining, what we're doing is we're putting data into a model, and we're having the model say, oh, okay, here are these variables or these columns. You want me to produce a result. But you want me to produce a result that predicts something. So, tell me what column you want me to learn from, and then I'll try and predict what it's going to be. In other words, if I gave the computer a deck of cards and I pulled out a red card and a black card and a red card and a black card, the computer is going to try and predict when I'm going to pull out a red or black card. We call that result of red or black, or we call that result of trying to predict what's going to happen, a target variable. And that's why I'm going to show you in this data source that we want good, bad, in other words, the card being red or black. We want the model to learn from all the other columns how to predict when that good or bad is going to be good or bad, when it's going to be red or black. So what we're going to do is we're going to say this is not a role of an input column, this is a role of a target column, because we want the model to learn how to imitate that, how to predict the results when we don't let it see what the answer is. Now we want all the others to be looked at by the model as potential places where it can learn from. So we want these columns to be input columns, and they're going to be input into the model will learn from them. Let's go ahead and hit next. Now, do we want to build models? Yes, we do. And the reason is because what's the point of data mining if you can't predict anything? So let's say yes. We want to build models. We're going to click next. And don't worry about that. We'll just go ahead and click next again. No, for this exercise we're going to keep it simple. We're not going to create a sample data set. We'll get to that in other videos. Now, the most important thing here is something else that's going to make your life very easy. If you tell the computer ahead of time what role this data that we just chose is going to play in your model, then you don't have to hook up nodes with extreme detail added to them. By assigning the proper role ahead of time, the nodes will be connected to each other, and they will connect in ways that default to the role you've picked. In other words, this data that we want the computer to learn from it. In other words, this is not a scoring data set, this is a training data set. Okay? It's going to train the model how to learn to predict. So, instead of raw, we're going to pick train. Now, when we hook up other modules to this data, they'll automatically see this and they'll set themselves up correctly without us having to do a lot of extra work. This is a great way to save time. We're going to click next. And it's giving you some metadata. We can ignore that. Later on we'll use it. And we're finished. Okay, very good. So now we have this data source showing up. The one that was connected to my Oracle data, the one that we assigned as training data, and in fact if you look down here, since we clicked on this data source, and because this is a property windows that tells you how things behave when you click on them, we clicked on the data source, we're seeing the properties, and one of those properties, the role is train. So go ahead and explore properties when you click on things. You'll end up learning a lot. Next, we're going to have the second part of our data. And what's different about this is that the structure is exactly the same as our training data, with one exception. Remember that variable that we wanted the model to be able to predict on? It was called good or bad. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to let the model learn how to predict the value of whether it's going to be good or bad. Now the second data source we're about to add, will not have that column in it. The model is going to have to predict it. That's the only difference between the second data source we're going to add and the first. So let's add the second data source without the good bad column, which is our target variable. It will not be present in this next data source. Now remember how we add our data sources. In this case, the second one, we're going to right click on data sources and say create data source. And remember, when SAS looks at an Oracle table, it appears to SAS just like a SAS table. So even though it's an Oracle table, we can say it's a SAS table. Now we're going to pick browse, and we're going to find the lib name that we created, which was my Oracle, when that dialog box comes up. And here is our lib name that we created, my Oracle. So I'm going to pick it, and when I pick that, the right window will now show our second data source. This, however, has an S in it. The first one had the name in it. This S in my data name stands for scoring. It's not a training role, it's a scoring role. We're going to explain that in just a second. So let's pick that. This is our scoring data. I'm going to click OK. This is the data that we're going to run through the model. And it's going to try and predict values based upon what it sees in the data. We're going to click yes because that's what we chose. myoracle.ml_tmagescr. Next. And we see some table properties. That's nice. Click next. And remember, you have to click advanced to be able to set up these roles, which make your life easier. So we're going to give this one the role of not training, we're going to give it scoring, and we'll explain that in just a moment. Okay, good. So now we have our inputs, but notice there is no good or bad column at all. We see all the columns except good for bad. Why? Because when you run this through the model, your data, your scoring data, is going to have something missing from it, the target variable. And that target variable will not be present. It will have to be predicted. That's the whole point of data mining. So let me speak about another role. I've already used the scoring data, and behind the scenes, without you looking at it, I've run it through a model already just to see how things go. I have created a score variable, but in this case I want to pretend that it's not there. I want the model to pretend it's not there. So I'm going to say rejected. And what that means is it's not going to pull that column in. It'll pull everything else in, and it will look at it to try and learn how to predict, because it has a role of input, each of these columns. So score will not be brought in. All the other columns will, because they have a role of input. Let's click next. Do I wish to create a sample data set? Maybe in advanced videos, but not this one. And the most important time-saving, make your life easier tip that I can give you at this point is this is the data source that we're not going to learn from. We're going to actually try to predict. And so when you see the word score, you can always translate that to predicted. So we're going to have this as a score role, a predictive role. Now it gives us some more information. That's fine. We're clicking finish. And we now have finally two data sources that we can use, and now we can start building a model and predicting values. So good, let's begin to build our model. Okay, what we're going to do just for an introductory video is build the simplest model we possibly can. In reality, you would make it far more sophisticated because when you're making business decisions, you want to make the models very good. That's not the purpose of this video, so let's build the simplest one we can. First, you can drag in your data sources. Now remember, the CR is our training data, which our model will learn from, and then the SCR is the scoring data that will run through the model and have the model predict the outcome, because this scoring data is missing the target variable, and a target variable means that's what you're trying to predict. So it will then try to calculate the target variable based on what it learns from the training data. Let's begin. Drag the training data into your diagram, but before we do that, I just realized we need to bring the diagram in. Let's open up the diagram and double click on the diagram name. We already gave it the name of My Project 1. Now that we have a diagram open, now I can drag the data source in. So let's do that. Let's bring it in. Good. And now what I will do is, they have connection points on these nodes. A little trick, it looks a whole lot nicer, I think, if you're going down rather than across. So I like to right click on the diagram space and have my connections going down rather than across. So I'm going to right click on the diagram space, hit layout, and say I want the connections to be vertical. What that will do is now allow me to connect things vertically rather than horizontally. It just looks better. I'm going to create some space, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a node that takes the classification of data and puts it into buckets so that our model can then make good decisions. So I'm going to go over to the Modify tab. Again, we'll get into details about all of these nodes in later videos. I'm going to choose an interactive binning because it looks at the data and creates separate buckets depending on the values inside the data, and this really helps us to build a model. Now, because we've already set up this data source as training, we don't have to do anything except just simply connect it. What I'm doing is I'm holding my mouse down and I'm just creating an arrow and then lifting my button off, and it creates the connection. Now when I click on this, all of the things are set up that we need, and that's because we set up the training data to have the role of training. So there's very little that we have to change at all in our next node. Now the next node that we want to do is bring in our model mode. So let's go into model, and we're going to do something very simple. We're going to use what's known as a regression model. I'm going to just bring this down, let go of the mouse button, and because the regression model knows the difference between a training data source and a scoring data source, we have to do very little to it when we connect it. We're just going to connect it here, and I'm just going to make one little change. When we click on this, or anything by the way, when we click on this, our properties windows shows us all the behaviors that we can modify for whatever we clicked on, in this case our regression model. I'm going to just change something so that we use a regression and I'm going to select the type of regression to be stepwise. Why? Well, because if we select none, it's not that great. If we select stepwise, it's a pretty good model. It's not great, but it's a good first step. We'll get into all of the different types of data mining algorithms in other videos, I promise. Now what we need to do is choose the Assess tab, and in the Assess tab we're going to pick what's known as It's called score. And what that does is it takes the values of your model and basically provides the extra column that you were trying to predict. Score looks at the model, the results are then fed into score, and then when we run this, it creates the extra column that is predicted based upon what the model learned from all the other columns. So let's go ahead and run this model first, and then we're going to run real data through it and get that to work with it. I'm going to take my second data source, which is the role of scoring, and we're going to drag it out to the space. And because this has the role of score, I don't really need to do anything in the score module in terms of changing the settings. The score node knows what to do when it gets scoring data. So that's the advantage of picking these roles ahead of time. At this point, we are now ready to run the model. So let's right-click and say Run. Do you want to run this path? Yes. And you're going to see on the right-hand corner of each of these nodes, they will turn green until they get to the bottom, and then we will be done. Let's click Yes. Very good. It took a little while. It took some time for this to happen. You need to have a little patience, and we're going to be adding improvements to our server to get a better response time, but it is a little slow in the beginning until we make those tuning adjustments. After taking some time, our model is now done running, and you'll get this message, Run Completed. If you'll also note that all of our nodes have these little green check marks on them. If there had been a problem, one of these nodes, or maybe more than one, would be red, and you would have to investigate and make the correction needed for you to run the entire, what we call, workflow. So everything's green. Let's go ahead and take a look at our results. I am going to click on Score, and if I go down to the imported data in the Properties window, I'm going to click on it and show you we had two paths coming in, the training data and the score data. So after clicking on imported data, we have data source of train, and that data does exist. We have the data source of score, and that data does exist. Why am I showing this to you? Because if we look at the score data and we say explore, we're going to note that the score data as it's coming in other words when it's being imported, does not have, if we scroll to all the columns in the score data when it comes into the model, does not have anything that we want to use at the moment for predictors. Okay, what I will show you is that when the data comes out of the model, it will have a bunch of predictor variables, and it will have a good or bad predicted. So let's go, instead of on the input side of this, let's go to the output side of the model. I'm going to close this input side of the model, and imported means input. We're going to click OK to get rid of this window. Now, again, clicking on this, instead of going to imported, I'm going to go to exported, and I'm going to see what came out of that model. So I'm going to right click. Actually, that was a left click. And now we see that score coming out of the model will look a little different, and it'll have the predictor columns as a result. When I hit explore again, this is the outs, and this is the data coming out of the model. If we scroll to the right, coming out of the model adds a bunch of other predictor variables, and something we didn't have in the original model was good, bad, and these predicted columns are numerical indicators that the model uses to come up with this final assessment of good or bad. So the end result is that we now have this column being predicted on data that does not contain this column going into the model. And that is the whole purpose of data mining, is that we can now create models to predict what's going to happen based upon all the other columns that it decided to use to come up with that evaluation.